I thought rather than spend a lot of time on my election musings, because you can see them in full at workinglife.org, where I will be posting today or tomorrow my final update. And hint, hint, I still think it's going to be a landslide. I thought instead on the show, I'd shine a little light on where the real battle will be after Election Day if Joe Biden does win. And that battle is keeping the corporate lobbyists out of government. Well, that's going to be almost an impossible task, but still a big fight to at least limit their influence. Now, check out this from a media outlet called Politico.com. And now I'm quoting a little story they had. Companies and the lobbyists who represent them in Washington are positioning themselves for a variety of Election Day outcomes, with most of the focus on a victory for Joe Biden. A Democratic president could foster major legislative battles over climate and environmental policy that were largely dormant during the Trump administration. And then the article goes on to say, this scenario prompted lobbying shops earlier this year to start tracking who Biden might include in his cabinet, to decipher the direction they might take at the EPA and other federal agencies, according to interviews with nearly a dozen lobbyists, many of whom requested anonymity to discuss internal conversations that could risk alienating their allies. By the way, those allies meaning in a Democratic administration. Then it goes on to say, trade associations are also mapping out how to approach a Congress under full Democratic control, either with or without a filibuster, the latter of which would make sweeping climate laws easier to pass the Senate, requiring only a simple majority instead of 60 votes. And that's the end of that passage. Now, that's the permanent government at work, the corporate lobbyists who have friends in both parties. And this will be a huge battle, my friends. You know that. And it's honestly one that is always tough, to slap back the grubby paws of these corporate elites and their corporate lobbyists. So to look deeply into this corruption that really is at the heart of why we don't have Medicare for all, why the Pentagon is rolling in dough, and why banks and Wall Street rip us off every day, it's great to have on the show Jeff Hauser, the executive director of the Revolving Door Project, which is under the umbrella of our friends at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. So I'm going to play a little bit of the devil's advocate in your favorite topic, the revolving door and the influence of lobbyists and corporate-related money and those kinds of folks that have been in these administrations for as long as you and I have been alive, actually. And I start from my experience recently as a delegate for Bernie Sanders, and I witnessed all these letters that folks were writing, particularly protesting the idea that certain people might be in the administration. At least that was what was talked about, people that were not really that believable and represented some threat to the progressive movement and progressive ideals. And the first question that comes to mind is, look, they have the power, meaning the Biden folks, the centrists who are running the campaign and who will likely play a big role in the administration. So how do we actually influence this? And do we actually think after the election, when they don't need us, assuming Biden wins, that we'll have any influence or leverage there?
That's a great question. I absolutely think we'll have some leverage. I don't think we'll have all the leverage. I don't think you will see a cabinet like we would have seen had Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren been the nominee and become elected president. But I think you will see a much better cabinet than we would have seen under Secretary Clinton or that we saw under President Obama when progressives were not as engaged with the transition. I think that what is our leverage? One, the Senate is going to be tight. Even if there's a Democratic majority, a handful of progressive senators can effectively deny any Biden appointee going through. Second, Biden sees himself, as he said, as the Democratic Party. And there are negatives one can draw from that, but there are also positives. And that is that he wants to be the center of the party. And that means he's going to listen to everyone. I think that that means that progressives who complain and can substantiate their complaints with real research and real reasoning I think will get heard. That doesn't mean the alternative to Larry Summers for Treasury Secretary will automatically be, Pramila Jayapal or Elizabeth Warren or someone. I think, it's going to, it may well end up being somewhere in between. So I think there's some chance on Warren, but I think the ability to play whack-a-mole with the most problematic corporate Democrats is significant because Biden will want to have a unified Democratic Party. I think disunity within the Democratic Party is going to be a weakness, given that the Republicans are going to be completely united against him.
But okay, so taking up your excellent responses and excellent points, let's start with this question about appointees. After the election, let's assume there's a Democratic sweep, because if there isn't, then sort of our conversation is almost irrelevant, especially when it comes to the U.S. Senate. Isn't there going to be a mood, let's not give Joe Biden too much grief from the outset because we have a lot bigger fish to fry? So you get a nominee who we progressives don't like. I'm thinking either someone in the foreign policy area like Susan Rice, who has come up a number of times, or you mentioned Treasury Secretary. I actually don't see that there's going to be huge opposition. Democrats actually trying to block a Biden appointee to a senior cabinet level position. I just don't buy it.
I think if you go back to a lot of the work Revolving Door Project and our allies do, go back to the 2013 fight over Larry Summers versus Janet Yellen for a Federal Reserve chair. And what happened is more and more research came out about why Larry Summers would be a terrible pick for Federal Reserve chair and why Janet Yellen was clearly the most qualified candidate for the position. She's no crazy lefty or something like you or I, but she, a progressive who cared about workers getting unemployment and would be willing to regulate the banks. It was obviously a lot better than Larry Summers. And we put that research out there, and we got to the point where not only were Sherrod Brown, Jeff Merkley, and Elizabeth Warren opposed, but Heidi Heitkamp and John Tester opposed Larry Summers on the Senate Banking Committee. I think a world in which Warren and Tester are willing to oppose Larry Summers under Barack Obama, one of the most charismatic presidents in our lifetime, probably the most charismatic, I think that suggests that the Joe Biden, who's much more of a compromise choice, essentially, within the Democratic Party, who reflects, as he himself puts it, a transition figure. I just don't think he is going to be able to force everyone in line. I think he is going to see himself as in a somewhat weaker position than that of trying to forge consensus. And so there'll be trade-offs. And so if the Secretary of State is a disappointment, I think that means you have a better chance of doing well on another appointment. Again, we're not going to get consistent wins across the cabinet. I think if we go into this process with that as our goal, we're probably setting out to be disappointed. But I think we can make real inroads.
And I think what's going to be underlying this, and a little bit of my skepticism, although I would love to live in the world that you're suggesting, and I hope you are correct, is that there's going to be this Trump exhaustion where people are going to basically say, let's first of all return the functioning of government, the functioning of the presidency, the Senate, presumably if there's a Democratic majority, getting rid of Mitch McConnell. Let's return things to what they consider to be normal. Let's not fight over these other things. So that's my sense of the mood. But I do think we probably agree that we're not necessarily going to win a position where we want somebody who's going to be at the head of HHS, for example. It's going to be advocating just every single day for Medicare for all, for example.
Yeah, I think that we're more going to be competing about shades of gray. But the importance of the executive branch is such that I think competing between shades of gray really matters. And it's not as inspiring and, as fighting for Medicare for all or free college and other big, bold, progressive promises. But it really matters to people's lives, whether or not you have an HHS that is going to work to rein in pharmaceutical companies, to work on march-in rights, including at NIH, and just really aggressively fight for patients and fight against the rentiers who are making so much money in our medical systems in the private sector, rein in health insurance company misbehavior. I think it really matters to have people who are mission committed. The mission of HHS is pro-patient. It's to make government work for people. And if you have somebody who really takes that into heart, even if they're not a committed progressive, if they just want HHS to function well, I think a lot of people will be better off.
And I'll reference the Labor Department, for example, as a pro-labor person, where those kind of appointments really potentially make a difference. And I'm going to guess, and this is your area of expertise, so educate us a little bit, that we're not just talking about the fights for the cabinet secretaries, but a lot of influence is wielded by the assistant secretaries, the people a cut below, the deputy secretaries. And that's where you can potentially have some more influence about pushing to have, for example, someone who's the head of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration that actually cares about making sure that workers don't get sick and die.
Yeah, that's a great example. Occupational safety, OSHA is the acronym, and unfortunately my work involves dealing with tons and tons of acronyms, but OSHA is in charge of keeping workers safe. And under COVID-19, that is one of the greatest signature failings of the Trump administration is its approach to workers during the pandemic. Essential workers who are so often workers of color, low to medium wage workers, be they meat packers or truck drivers, they in America have very few safety precautions because Trump has terrible human beings at his Department of Labor. And Obama had excellent people. Obama's OSHA was good. Obama's wage and hour person who made sure that people were getting the overtime they were entitled to and otherwise just standing up for lower wage workers, that was a good person. Like, we had actual people committed to the mission of the Labor Department, especially in second term Obama, but including in first term. And that made a difference in people's lives. There'd be fewer people dead, workers dead in this country if we had an OSHA that cared about workers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's dig a little bit into OSHA because I do think it gives a good picture about the problems of the system as a whole. Even under Obama and the AFL-CIO, you work for the AFL-CIO, so you know this, every year puts out a statistic on OSHA that says that if OSHA tried to visit every single workplace just once under Obama administration funding, it would take something like 110 years. So you're right that if we were in the pandemic and you had actually someone at the head of OSHA who cared about actually saving workers, there's probably a lot of people who would be alive today and wouldn't have gotten sick during the pandemic. But in the bigger sense, the system, the way in which OSHA has been structured, really is set up to let corporations continue to do really whatever they please in the workplace on a day-to-day basis. And that goes to the point that you work on so hard. These lobbyists, they're like leeches. And they just flood into Congress and certainly in the executive branch, and they just look for those places to basically keep the system intact, even if you've got a somewhat more friendly administration. Am I wrong about this?
No, you're absolutely right. And that's actually part of what the biggest decisions in the Biden administration will be made in January and February. And the appointees will be negotiating with Congress over what is likely to be an omnibus spending bill as well as a stimulus package. The federal government spending right now expires in December. It'll probably be a patch through, if anything, to get the government from December until January 20th or maybe a few days beyond. And that bill to fund the government for the rest of 2021, that is so important. Early on in Obama, one of the best things that happened in Obama in 2009, they hired a bunch more civil rights lawyers for DOJ civil rights. The DOJ Civil Rights Division had been decimated under George W. Bush.
That's the Department of Justice, just so we get off the acronym. That's okay.
And so the Justice Department's ability to fight for civil rights and its willingness had been crushed under George W. Bush. And Barack Obama and Tom Perez, who was his initial civil rights director, they got an allocation of money to hire more civil rights attorneys in their first measures in 2009. And they radically increased the capacity of the DOJ Civil Rights Division. They didn't address all problems. It didn't make everything go away. Racism did not end, but they made real progress. We think that approach needs to be wildly expanded across government so that an agency like the Occupational Safety Agency can get realistic funding that can allow it to be more successful. I think that happening as soon as possible when those lobbyists are as distracted as possible. There's going to be so much going on in the early days of a Biden presidency. First of all, you're going to have whatever Trump's up to, which I'm sure is going to be crazy, and it's going to be hard for people to take their eyes off of it. And to some extent, we should view that as an opportunity. We should have Congress pass the type of things that the lobbyists would go after if it were a one-off and they had time to really focus on this and talk about like some crazy big government conspiracy to have people raiding workplaces on behalf of workplace safety concerns. But they're going to have so many concerns. There are going to be so many cabinet appointments and whatnot that if we go agency by agency and increase the hiring capacity of the Biden appointees, we can make real progress. And I just don't think the lobbyists will be able to stop it. And we should make that an early Biden era priority while there's chaos before the corporate lobbyists can really get their hooks in.
But we're still working within the same system and framework that exists even in good times that really is not, from a progressive point of view, the vision that we would want in terms of the kind of society that we would like to see. I get your tactical approach is to make the best situation that might present itself to progressives. And I'm thinking of this in a progressive lens, but I think you'd probably agree that that's in some way, frankly, somewhat of a holding action. For example, in safety and health, we have to remake the safety and health system so that workers can actually, in the way they do in Scandinavian countries, shut down production if there's a danger to folks. Right now, that's not true. Corporations basically run the companies, run the plants, run the factories, run the offices. So my point really is, once we've done this action within the Biden administration, what would you want to then work on to basically stop this kind of corporate influence? What's the big picture? What's the dream situation that we would have so we can actually work to turn this country into something more progressive?
We need to teach people that government can be part of a solution, that there are problems in their lives and they are capable of response as we as a society, we through our government, through our democracy, can address problems of corporate power and greed. Workers who are getting hurt at work do not necessarily know that there is an OSHA, that there is an acronym, but behind that acronym are supposed to be human beings who are expert in helping them. They don't know this. And so to my mind, the more we make government succeed for people, the more constituencies we can build up, the more possibility. I think cynicism is really one of the biggest struggles that progressives face, both in electoral politics as well as issue politics and in movement. You have to convince people that there are wins possible. And so some of these smaller bore, more tactical victories, I think they build experience winning, they build faith, they build power, and they put the bad guys, the corporate malefactors, on the defensive. And I think those are all good things. I don't have a plan for revolution in 90 days or something.
Damn. That's why I called you up, man. I wanted the plan for 90 days. So 90 days, we'll have nirvana, we'll have revolution.
Yeah, it's a bit of a bait and switch. But I do think in 90 days, we can put a lot of corporate malefactors back on their heels. And I think that's got to be the goal. And the more you have them on their defensive, and the more you're convincing people that there are solutions to problems, I think the more you empower them to think even bigger, to believe it, to have hope, to not give in to cynicism. And then you have your next big opportunities. Like a lot of hard work was going on in Black Lives Matter from 2014 until May of 2020. And it was that hard work and the incremental gains that they achieved that allowed them to move forward so greatly in the spring and summer of this year. So I think we need to build ourselves for the next moment, the next Occupy, the next opportunity for real big progressive change. I think you win as many times as you can before that opportunity presents itself. And the more you've won, the more likely you can take full advantage of those opportunities.
I love as we wrap up here, I love your analogy to Black Lives Matter, because you're totally right. The advancement of the debate about racism and the actions that have taken place in just the last 6 months have been, to me, one of the great positive things that have happened in 2020 with all the horrors that we've seen in other aspects. But if you look at the conversation about race now, and I know that you agree with this, it's not over. We're just starting it, but the advance on that has been quite dramatic. So I guess for you, the parallel is you win some things at the federal level, and then you can go back to the movement, to the base, and say, we're only going to have power if we have more victories here, we elect the right people, because we can actually influence government. But let's face it, right now it's a holding action. We've made some progress, we've got some influence, but we have to have more.
Yeah, you have to say that the other side is beatable, change is possible, and that's why we can go bigger. I think people need self-confidence. We have an entire system. I mean, cynicism is the best ally that corporate and rich people have. Corporate malefactors, rich people, they love cynicism. They win in a context in which people are disengaged. And I think it's hard to keep people engaged unless they're seeing forward progress. And so the incremental gains that were made in many cities from 2014 to 2020, I think helped steel people's spine for the bold actions that were taken this spring. But as you know, reform is not only hard and takes a while, but it also takes sustained engagement. We're not going to win this all in any one given period of time. And then once it's won, it'll take care of itself. And so part of why Revolving Door Project focuses on the executive branch is the whole goal is to pass some really good bills. Someone's going to have to implement them. The bills are not self-implementing, and that's kind of what the executive branch does. You pass laws, be it in the 19th century, like the Sherman Antitrust Act or the Wagner Act in the 1930s. How we implement them today in the 21st century is really, really important.
Well, Jeff, you're the expert on this topic, and unfortunately, you've set yourself up here because I'm going to have you back on the show once if Biden wins, which I think at the point we're talking about, it looks somewhat likely, and we're going to have to then evaluate how all that work and leverage and infiltration, if I can use that word, how we've been able to influence it and where that administration is going with those appointments. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure. Anytime.